the idea that there's an easy and untroubled frontier between what a nation is and what an empire is, it's just not really true. I mean, Britain is something that historically was a kind of an imperial entity, even within its own islands. And it's become more of a nation, and now that nationality is again in question.
Politics in America, Britain, and other Western nations, reads the blurb for the Edmund Burke Foundation's National Conservatism series of conferences, have taken a sharp turn toward nationalism, a commitment to a world of independent nations. In the US and the UK, this inflection point crystallized in 2016 with the result of the Brexit referendum and the election of Donald Trump. In continental Europe, the torch has been picked up by an arc of national-populist parties, from Viktor Orbán's Fidesz to Spain's Vox, Italy's Fratelli d'Italia, and Poland's Law and Justice Party. Now, the latest such NatCon conference was held last week this side of the pond, in Brussels, bringing together a colorful assortment of right-wing politicians, scholars, and journalists at a ritzy venue a short walk away from the seat of EU institutions. Naturally, the gathering had been planned well before Russian troops invaded Ukraine, and the conference had to adjust to a fast-moving news cycle accordingly. The ongoing Russo-Ukrainian war has also predictably shaken up the French presidential race. This week, we sit down with Sebastian Milbank, who covered the NatCon summit extensively for the Critic magazine, to unpack the conference's main themes and to assess the state of play in France a mere 10 days away from the first round of voting. As always, please remember to rate, review, and subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts or the platform of your choice. And if you're feeling generous, please consider donating as little or as much you can through our Patreon page, linked in the show notes. Enjoy the episode.
So, first of all, thank you so much, Sebastian Milbank, for coming on the show. Sebastian Milbank is a fantastic writer. He is writing for the Critic, and on this special topic, he has been writing a lot of articles on the National Conservative Conference, which I highly recommend you go and give a read to. So thank you so much, Sebastian, for joining us.
No, thank you very much for having me.
And Jorge, why don't you get us started? Because unlike the both of us, Sebastian and I were here for press, but you were here as a host. You were speaking. You were speaking at the NatCon conference. Can you kind of give us an idea of what the main themes of a NatCon movement is? What drives them and what unites them?
Yeah. Let me just begin by saying, first of all, this was, if my understanding is correct, the third European conference of NatCon. And NatCon, by the way, I'll just begin by defining what it is. NatCon is a forum which was spawned by the Edmund Burke Foundation. The Edmund Burke Foundation is a public affairs institute, a kind of think tank based out of Jerusalem. And which started running these NatCon conferences a while back. I think the very first one was in 2016, which was the year, obviously, of Brexit and the election of Donald Trump. And in their own words, what the Edmund Burke Foundation saw happening in 2016 was a sharp turn toward nationalism across Western politics. Right? They saw, here there was the British people voting for independence from the EU, and the American people. Or a large plurality of the American electorate voting for Donald Trump. And so the Edmund Burke Foundation started putting together these conferences, the first of which was actually in London with the late Roger Scruton, Daniel Hannan, and a range of other very prominent Tory politicians. So this is just kind of to give you a bit of a background on what they've been up to, and also, I mean, the NatCon, the people associated with NatCon sometimes can come off as fringe, but in reality, there's been a strong sort of record of inviting establishment figures, people from established political parties like the Conservative Party in the UK and the Republican Party in the US. So they're not as fringe as its critics might see it, but so essentially this was the third European conference. So London was the first one. The second one was Rome, which is also very kind of significant because that's when they had Prime Minister Viktor Orbán address the conference. And the third one was in Brussels. I think the main reason for it was in Brussels was because it was kind of synchronized with the meeting of the EU Council that was taking place on the same week,
and NATO, I believe, as well,
and NATO as well. And so yeah, I mean, and to your question of what do the National Conservatives stand for? Well, I think this one will also be an interesting one to get Sebastian's thoughts in. I'll just broach upon kind of two key themes. So I think the political ideology of the NatCon movement is perhaps best summarized in The Virtue of Nationalism, which is Yoram Hazony's 2018 book, which was awarded the Intercollegiate Studies Institute Book of the Year Award, which is kind of the conservative book prize in America. And the Virtue of Nationalism, I remember reading it when it first came out. Really grabbed a copy as soon as it hit the shelves, and in it, Yoram Hazony essentially divides up political theory between kind of two main schools of thought, right? On one side, there are the nationalists, and on the other side, there are the imperialists. And essentially, nationalism is the rejection of empire. It's the rejection of imperialism. It's the idea that the proper scale at which to organize a polity, a political community, is the nation state. Anything larger than the nation state is an empire. And empires are inherently unstable. They're inherently undemocratic. They're inherently oppressive, whereas nations are the only, the only kind of scale at which liberty can flourish, liberty and prosperity can flourish. This is kind of the bedrock philosophy behind national conservatism. But and again, we can sort of compare that with what it is that the people associated with national conservatism are proposing in terms of public policy. But I think those are some of the basic kind of philosophical commitments that you can see in national conservatism.
Yeah, no, that's terribly interesting because I'll admit I'm not a particular. I mean, I've always been something of a critic of Hazony's perspective there. Precisely, I mean, it's always struck me as, for example, I mean, this idea that if something's too large, it's an empire. Well, I don't know what the United States of America, which I'm sure Hazony grants as a nation. It's 300 million citizens. It's a land area and a population vastly larger than most of the empires of history. And even in a world of mass communications, it's a society that vastly exceeds any scale that could be considered organically democratic. And that's clear. And I think the idea that there's an easy and untroubled frontier between what a nation is and what an empire is, it's just not really true. I mean, Britain is something that historically was a kind of an imperial entity, even within its own islands. And now it's become more of a nation, and now that nationality is again in question. And precisely in the move towards nation, Britain's become more unstable. I mean, if you look, for example, at the relationship between Scotland and England, it was easier to handle as a decentralized imperial venture, and fusing it together into a single nation. And the historians have written about this. If you particularly look at the 20th century experience of the invention of British nationhood, it's been an experiment that has ultimately led to instability. I mean, the same is true in Spain, where moving away from a more idea of Spain as an imperial entity towards a national one has created tensions of seeing things like the Catalan independence movement explode. So that's kind of my ideological concern. And then in terms of the conference itself, I was very struck that I would say things like this to people, and I get quite a lot of agreement. So I was very struck, for example, that a lot of people said they quite liked the idea of empire. And I was also, one of the paradoxes, I think, of National Conservatism Conference is that here is a movement whose founder, without question, says that he's suspicious of empire and transnational entities, but it's a series of nationalists organizing internationally, for shared ideological and security concerns. And I don't see how you escape, whether you like to use the word empire or not, I don't see how you escape at least imperial concepts when you organize at that level.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting because next week we'll be releasing an episode on the revolutions of 1848. And there's an interesting conversation. We had Professor Clark and Professor Jonathan Sperber, who wrote two fantastic books and articles on those issues. But it was an interesting moment of the conversation where we kind of realized that 1848 is remembered to some extent as a European moment because all these revolutions happened at the same time. But what is quite striking is, in the end, those who seem to be more efficiently organized at the European level were actually the conservative and the reactionaries who kind of coordinated to crush the revolutions across Europe together. So it's interesting to see that nationalism can have this kind of international, well, not nationalism back then, obviously. The right wing that back then was fiercely anti-nationalistic.
I was going to say
Yeah.
that's what's quite interesting
Yeah.
because, of course, the nationalists of the 19th century
Yeah.
were the liberals.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, left wingers. So yeah, it's an interesting conversation to have with this kind of historical frame back here. But you were talking about the UK, and actually something that struck me, and I think probably says a lot about the kind of not just a NatCon conference, but kind of larger nationalist movement in Europe. It's that we hardly mentioned Brexit. And given the fact one of the first conferences was in London, given the fact we talked about the UK and Brexit incessantly for the past 4 years, it was actually quite striking that nobody really talked about Brexit. I think we had historian Andrew Roberts who talked a little bit about Brexit because he was talking about Churchill and Zelensky. But I
I
don't.
have to admit, I have the opposite impression. Nearly every British guest mentioned Brexit.
Yeah,
I
no
think
one
what was
else.
more striking was that the Europeans didn't,
Yeah,
and the
exactly.
British.
Exactly, and I think it's quite striking because it seems to me like the larger nationalist movement has kind of come to a uncomfortable truce with the EU, which is Brexit hasn't been a incredible success. It hasn't been the disastrous failure as well that some predicted, but it hasn't been an incredible success for sure. It's been 4 years of incredible tension on the British political system. And so even like, Marine Le Pen in France or Matteo Salvini in Italy, no longer are they saying, we need to leave the Eurozone, we need to leave the EU. Nowadays, they barely talk about the EU at all. Salvini is even more complicated because he joined a kind of large center-right, center-left, right-wing, far-right, I don't know, huge coalition in Italy with Mario Draghi. So he's in a bit of a tough position. But it seems to me like there's very few major political parties on the right to far right nowadays who are saying we need to leave the EU, because I think people have accepted that, first of all, economically it doesn't look great, but also kind of electorally, people don't want that, especially the kind of older electorate, which tends to be voting disproportionately in major elections. Again, look in France. Zemmour isn't saying anything about the EU. He says, he says my model is Viktor Orbán. I want to stay within the EU, and when the EU asks me to do things I don't want to, I just tell them to fuck off. And I think it was quite, nobody talked about Brexit. It wasn't used as a model by anyone except the Brits.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that this really is connected kind of to the fact that for one thing, some of these continental nationalists, some of these European nationalists are genuinely disappointed, or rather, they genuinely regret that the Brits ended up leaving. For instance, I'm thinking of the Polish Law and Justice Party, which was allied with the British Tories in the European Parliament. They belong to the same sort of parliamentary grouping. Whereas people, for instance, the departure of the Brits has had a rebalancing effect. It has obviously empowered the Franco-German axis. It may have kind of weakened the position of, say, the Baltic states or other Eastern and Central European states that relied on Britain to be the pro-Atlanticist voice within the European Union. But I think I totally agree with you. I was pretty. Brexit in a way was the culmination of the NatCon philosophy. It was a country taking it upon itself to become independent from the shackles of the European Union, and yet it is not. See, I'll be absolutely frank on this one. I'm a big. I wasn't perhaps at the time, but I'm a big supporter of Brexit now, and I think of Brexit as kind of a a big moment in the NatCon crusade, so to speak. But I agree with you that it wasn't. It was ubiquitously absent. It was ubiquitously absent from the conference.
Yeah, absolutely. And Sebastian, I wanted to bounce on that. I have something which is a bit tangential to this, so feel free to go ahead.
No, I mean, I don't think I was just going to say that. I mean, I do think that this sense that there's this. I would notice at the conference particularly that there was this kind of Anglo-American Atlanticist focus, which talked a lot about Brexit. But what struck me about that was I kept questioning the relevance of it. Like, it had been done, it had happened, but none of the Central Eastern European countries, especially in the current context, were thinking about leaving the EU or even talking about it. I mean, even though there were a few noises were made critical about the EU, it was mostly about what direction it should take. It was quite it was a constructive criticism. There's a sense in which I wasn't quite sure what Brexit was contributing to the movement. Because there was a sense in which, like, what strategic possibilities were being opened up, what economic potentials were happening.
Yeah.
It felt like it was symbolically significant for people involved in the movement that people had said it, but it was hard to see what work it was doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And it'd be tough for countries like Poland and Hungary to say we need to leave the EU, because obviously, they've been showered with EU funding over the past 30 years. So it's obviously, not in their best interest. In the UK, it was in a different position, of course, because it was a net contributor, and also because I think we can't ignore the history behind all of this. I mean, the UK is an island which had an empire outside of Europe for most of its history, or at least recent history. And countries like Hungary and Poland have quite bitterly experienced the cost of isolation in a rough geopolitical landscape. And I think that's something which was made very apparent with Ukraine, which is a very smooth transition for me to talk about the question of Ukraine, because this conference was planned months ahead of this, but obviously it took a very, very different tone with what happened in Russia and Ukraine, because all of a sudden you felt like a lot of the speakers who weren't expected to talk about Ukraine felt like they had to talk about Ukraine. And it really showed, I think, a bit of a rift. And this time we talked a lot about the kind of Anglo-American rift with central continental Europeans. But what's quite striking, actually, is to see that those division lines happen to be within the continentals themselves. It was quite interesting to see the Hungarians and the Poles, for example, taking very different positions. I just saw that Zelensky was singling out Viktor Orbán earlier this week for not being strong enough in his support for Ukraine and not letting weapons to go through Hungary to go to Ukraine. And on the other hand, Poland has been drumming up the possibility of a Russian invasion for years now. And to be honest, most Europeans took them a bit like, okay, well, we understand the Poles have this kind of ancestral rivalry with Russia, and you're a bit paranoid, so we'll kind of tolerate it. But they're completely vindicated now. And it's quite striking to see about, the whole conversation was upended by the event in Ukraine.
Yeah. And this is really a really interesting point, I think, where I would love to get Sebastian's thoughts in, because I think one of the things you're seeing, particularly at this conference, is that the kind of united front of national conservatism that spans the whole European continent, and it goes from Poland's government all the way to the Hungarian government, by way of countless other European countries that also have their national conservative parties. This sort of united front is not necessarily... It is not as united as you might expect on the issue of Russia. So on one hand, yes, sure, the entire conference was an act of support for the Ukrainian people. And what Yoram's kind of interpretation of what's going on is he says what's at threat what's being threatened by Russia is the Ukrainian nation, not some sort of abstract ideology of liberalism. It's the very real and concrete fact of Ukrainian nationhood that is being threatened by Russia's invasion. And I think he very elegantly and kind of he very successfully hooked the entire conference around the issue of let's respond to what's going on in Ukraine and let's have everyone kind of show that we're united, a united front. But this united front is not as united as you may think, because as you just said, the Poles are blaming the Hungarians. The Hungarians have this sort of very pro-peace stand, right? They're essentially saying that it's in Hungary's interest that the two sides come to a negotiated settlement and that the war ends as soon as possible. The Poles instead are saying that this war absolutely needs to be lost by Putin. So again, there are considerable nuances, even though everyone at the conference was very adamant and very clear cut that Russia's aggression was an act of lawlessness, and call it what you will, but there were some nuances, some important nuances in how each of these countries and each of these movements was approaching the issue. I wonder if that's what you got away as well, Sebastian.
Oh, I mean, completely. I mean, one thing that was it was already obvious from their public statements that Hungary was trying to kind of tread what it saw as a path of moderation in terms of sanctioning Putin, and that Poland was taking an incredibly belligerent tone. And you could, they were on stage, there was apparent unity. Behind the scenes, everyone I talked to, you could sense, particularly from anyone coming close to Hungary, this feeling that people were going way over the top, condemning Russian culture and Russian people. A sense that, till 5 minutes ago, people were not nearly so strong against Putin, and that, and then on the other hand, you sense from the polls a real sort of almost crusading desire to take down Putin. I think history explains a lot of this. Poland has been historically occupied and still feels threatened by Russia. Hungary is, of course, a long way away and has a lot more sympathy.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's also, how can I put this? It's also interesting, given the entire conversation we had around the role of the EU and how it was seen by the kind of Anglo-American Brexiteers and the rest of continental Europe, because I think the Anglo-Americans used the opportunity of Ukraine to kind of denounce the potential of a EU army as being kind of divisive and unnecessary in those times of tensions when the Atlantic family should reunite. Whereas I think continental Europeans had a kind of a different approach. Obviously, the French saw this as an opportunity to defend strategic autonomy, blah blah blah. When they believed in it, some of the French believed it was nonsense. But and it was quite interesting actually to see, I think, where Central Europeans like the Poles laid. I think there's a lot of positive things said, not just in that conference, but kind of general by Poland, by Hungary, about the concept of kind of larger European autonomy in those moments. Because I think what was made quite apparent over the past few months is that America is a bit of a waning influence, a waning power in Europe. It won't be able forever to hold us together. And so I can think the conversation of what role does the EU play in all this is just a moment to kind of link ourselves even tighter to Russia. And then there's the entire conversation about China. What role should the EU play? Should the EU be completely aligned with China? Should, on the contrary, play a bit more of a balancing role between the US and China? And should it be autonomous in the kind of Ukraine front? Should it be much more in much closer coordination with United States? Now, obviously, it's not strategic autonomy or NATO. They're obviously very much compatible, these options. But I think the kind of different of accentuation between those different options was quite striking.
Yeah, and I think I think there was a general sense that there was a need for resilience in terms of supply chains, in terms of defense industry, and I think there was definitely a contradiction between the sense that we needed to bind ourselves ever closer to America, and then the reality that this is a conflict in which America is not directly intervening. And it's also a conflict in which many European powers' independent actions have had a great effect. Whether it's Britain providing anti-tank weaponry, whether it's Europe hosting most of the refugees, most of the heavy lifting here is being done by European countries. And and there's in theory in extremis, the Americans come in, but again, the Americans coming in also heightens the risk of escalation, and nuclear war, and it's a situation where sometimes the smaller interventions, smaller countries being able to get involved, might allow us to deal with conflicts and crises in a way that doesn't pull us into international conflicts and entanglements.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of entanglements in Russia and Ukraine, I think this might be the moment we start pivoting to the French election. Unless we can cut this, but does anyone want to say anything on the NatCon movement? Maybe a few words on what kind of. Maybe we should talk about wokeism. Actually, let's talk about wokeism a little, because I think that's the one thread that really united everyone: is wokeism is bad. So let's talk about wokeism. We'll go back to France a bit later, because it's obviously more interesting to talk about the nuances, the differences between a movement, rather than kind of describing something as being kind of a monolith where everybody agrees, which obviously is never the case. It's more interesting to go through the nuances, the different movements within the currents, and so on. But there's one thing which I thought was quite strong, is whether it was the Anglo-Americans or the Central Continentals or whatever, people very much did not want le wokisme or wokeism. I'm not sure how you say in Hungarian or Poland. But it's interesting because we had Rodrigo Ballester on the podcast a few months ago. He was one of the speakers at the NatCon conference. We had him with Brice Couturier, who is a famous French journalist who talks a lot about the EU and international affairs. And it's quite striking that the EU has been increasingly associated with woke ideas, and whether it is the EU institutions like the EU Parliament or the Commission or the courts, for example. But it's quite striking to see. Rodrigo Ballester made a speech about how EU institutions had become too totalitarian, or not totalitarian, but kind of went way too far in their force feeding of woke ideas to European countries. And it's kind of an interesting situation because I think most people kind of instinctively are anti-woke. I think if you intend to do some kind of referendum or wokeism, yes or no, I think people would vote 70% no and 30% yes, something along those lines. But it was interesting to see how Brice Couturier, the French journalist, responded, because he's very much pro-EU, but he's also very anti-woke. And it's kind of an interesting situation where he had to kind of say wokeism is bad and somehow it's within the EU, but it has nothing to do with the EU as an organization. It just happened to be there and we need to fight it. And Macron is a strong combatant against woke ideas. And so therefore the EU will be fine. But I think that's really what unites the NatCon movement, is they find that angle in which they can hit on the EU, which is the EU is too socially liberal, it's too woke, and it's creating too much unnecessary tension where different countries should be allowed to have their own kind of cultural, political model rather than having kind of Anglo norms imposed from the outside.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think the point that he was that Rodrigo was referencing, I think primarily, and the one we discussed in our episode with him, was the guidelines on inclusive communication that had been published by Helena Dalli, who is the Maltese Commissioner for Equality, and essentially she circulated these guidelines to the entire European Commission, where among other things, she said, avoid using the word Christmas. Avoid referring to the traditional family. Avoid referring to refer to whatever pronouns people want to go by, and that kind of thing. So, and again, I think, and this was really summarized pretty well by Rodrigo's speech, which was titled "European Values Are None of the EU's Business." Right? I mean, the EU has in its founding treaties, in the treaties, the commitment to defend European values, which are not very concretely defined. They're kind of left vague. But progressives in the European Union these days are interpreting European values to mean, diversity in kind of diversity in inclusion and all of this sort of the woke mantras. So NatCons never expected that the EU would kind of get involved in social policy issues like abortion and whatnot. But now there's this really expansive interpretation that's being done of European values, and now we've seen that the European Parliament has been issuing rebukes to Poland, for instance, rebukes of Poland's pretty restricted abortion policy. So this is something that we never expected the EU would get involved in, but now we're seeing it does.
It's so tactically inept as well, because, I mean, the EU, first of all, is not the most unpopular institution in Europe. I think in many cases, national governments tend to be more unpopular than the EU, but it's not equally a hugely enthusiastic organization for which people across Europe feel strongly about. And kind of associating with kind of fringe ideas, which are not very popular, when there's always kind of this accusation of being, undemocratic and being kind of too far away from people's concerns. It just seems to me like there's a lack of tactical thinking. Anyways.
I mean, I think it's not really a question of tactics. I think that it's a question that it's a question of ideology. That that whenever you have a global organization, an international organization, in the modern Western world, in the kind of intellectual climate in which we exist, it will be run through the ideals that liberal people have for international relations and foreign policy, and that is one of kind of international human rights, humanitarianism as they would see it, the dignity and autonomy of individuals upheld by a kind of liberal, rules-bound international order. And you've seen things like the head of MI6 in Britain saying at the outbreak of the conflict in Ukraine that what divided us from Putin was LGBTQ plus rights. And now we're regardless of whether you're a staunch social conservative or staunch social liberal on issues like that. I think we should be able to agree that that's not what this conflict is about, that these are not countries that are wildly different in their attitude towards gay people in terms of their laws and their social attitudes. There's some difference, but it's not huge. And the fact that this is the way that Westerners want to see this conflict tells you a lot about what international relations are about, which is they're often not actually about interrelations between different cultures and embodying an international order, although that's what it's supposed to be about. It's actually often curiously internal. It's about an elite declaring its own values and living them out.
It's also sociology, it's
religious.
It's a kind of demographic profile. It's sociology. It's kind of, but what I think it might be a tactical issue is if the EU isn't just kind of civil servants and young graduates coming from top elite universities where those ideas are very strong. It's also a lot of politicians. Some of them are kind of pre-retired. Some countries consider the EU as kind of a pre-retirement for kind of washed-up politicians, but it's not the case in all of those countries. Look at Germany. Look at some countries take the EU quite seriously and send some kind of prominent first-rate politicians. And that's why I think it's a bit of I think some kind of tactical error is that those political leaders should sense that it's a bit short-sighted and a bit dangerous for the EU to be associated so strongly with those ideas. It might be unfair. It might be kind of good posturing by Orbán and the rest of it. But it's just something to keep in mind of. It'll be interesting to see the results of the Hungarian election actually on this, because that might change the conversation on the EU quite a lot actually in the years to come. Anyway, so let's do the long announced pivot to the French election. It's kind of crazy. I didn't see time fly. It's in 10 days basically, which is ludicrous. Yeah. I feel like it's a bit of an early election compared to other presidential elections. But first of all, the last time we did a podcast on the French election was, I think, before the Ukraine war. So, wow, a lot of things have changed since. There's been a very kind of natural rally around the flag phenomenon, with Macron kind of reaching the low 30s in some polls, which was kind of credible given he had been basically stagnant around 25% for the past 2 or 3 years. And all of a sudden he gets a huge boost. What that has been, though, is also candidates like Zemmour and Le Pen, who have been associated with Russia and Putin. I mean, Zemmour has had some crazy quotes about Putin in the past. You know, France needs a French Putin. Vladimir Putin is a great leader, yada yada yada. And I'm sure you could do it with most politicians, but Zemmour said it with such bravado that he's being punished especially hard nowadays, and he's now kind of around 10% rest of it. But what's quite incredible is Zemmour had spent the first 4 months of the campaign in kind of September, October, November, December. He was kind of pushing his ideas of immigration, security, identity, and all of a sudden they seem like swept away in a few days by the entire story of Ukraine. And yeah, as it stands, I have a bit of a poll aggregator here. Macron is at 28%, according to kind of average of different polls. Le Pen is at 19%. Mélenchon is at 14%. That's a big story here. Zemmour is 11%. Pécresse is at 11%. Pécresse being the centre-right candidate. And then you get the Greens at 6%. The Communists at 4%. That's also quite funny. The Communists are ahead of a Socialist Party, which is at 2%, which is, I don't know, kind of ludicrous. I think the last time the Communist Party was ahead of a Socialist Party was probably in the 1970s, maybe. So it's a big development.
Yeah.
But anyways, Sebastian, as an outsider who I guess probably has been chiming a little bit on the French election over the past few months, I don't know, what do you make of the election? And I think how it contrasted with the more recent British elections, which were, I guess, I was going to say more traditional, but no, they were completely upended by Brexit.
Yeah, I think, first of all, British people are fantastically unaware of French politics, which occasionally comes to them as a series of dramatic images shorn from their context. I think possibly that impression is heightened by the structure of French politics, which has, every sort of 8 years or so, this incredibly high stakes, very dramatic fight between figures that all seem extraordinary by British standards. I mean, even in the era of Trump and Boris, French politicians will say things that you could never say in a million years in the British context, and the person saying it will be someone who is considered to be in the centre of French politics. Yeah. I think that the degree to which the French are just politically different than the English, and even a lot of countries in Europe, can't be overstated. And I also think that the fact that you have all of the politics in between these very kind of dramatic elections that British people don't see, so that we're always surprised by it. We're always surprised by who are the candidates, what's happening, and I think no one in France is surprised to the same degree.
Well, I want to blow our own trumpet, so to speak, here a little bit, because I think the last time we did an episode, which was probably a month ago, Mélenchon was at 10%. He was kind of getting there. He's clearly ahead of the kind of scattered left-wing field. And I remember saying, be careful, there's going to be a kind of tactical voting phenomenon, which is going to snowball, where left-wing voters are going to say, okay, well, I've got no chance to win if I vote for the socialists. I have no chance to win if I vote for the Greens. Actually, that Mélenchon guy might have a chance to make it to the runoff, which is exactly what happened to Mélenchon in 2017, where he kind of siphoned all the socialist votes from Benoît Hamon, who dropped from 20% to 6% in a matter of weeks. And so, as of now, he's 5 points behind Le Pen. But since the participation rates are reported to be likely going to be very low in a few days' time, actually, by now, the entire kind of model is completely screwed up. The pollsters really do not know how reliable their models are. They were quite accurate in 2017, and they predicted Macron would do well. But my question is, will they be able to predict if participation rates are only kind of 65%, 70%, which would be very low for presidential election? That could kind of throw off a few things. So I don't know, something to follow. And yeah, Mélenchon is a good campaigner. He's one of the kind of old school guys who knows how to speak. He speaks tremendously well. I think it's quite striking, actually, back in 2017. Even more conservative-leaning voters for a second, like, actually, could I vote for this guy? Because he spoke well. He spoke, with in proper French, with a lot of kind of historical and literary references in his speeches. And I think the French like to be flattered by that way. And so he did very well. He did 20% for kind of far left. That's huge. Yeah, I don't know. It's essentially French Corbyn to some extent,
Yeah.
but outside of a socialist party, I guess.
Mm. Yeah, and we should perhaps touch a word, Francois, on the Zemmour phenomenon. I mean,
Yeah.
Zemmour had a very, let's call it, stormy sort of entry into the political contest. When he declared his candidacy with a very kind of almost a very sort of with this famous snippet or video that he published where essentially he was imitating or emulating Charles de Gaulle's address of the 18th of June, 1940. That created, that sort of Zemmour entered in a sort of big splash, right?
Yeah.
Created a whole lot of buzz around him. He started gaining a lot of momentum, but then his campaign kind of stalled in the last few weeks. And the one thing we should perhaps mention is that just a couple of days ago on Sunday, this past week, Zemmour held a meeting, a huge rally at the Trocadéro, where he was able to, I think, gather 100,000 people, which is huge. I mean, really massive, even for the Trocadéro. So I know that a lot of people, obviously, in his own camp, are disputing the media narratives about Zemmour losing steam. They claim that Zemmour is being underrated or underestimated by the polls, and that come election day, a great many more people will actually turn out for Zemmour. I mean, when you're seeing he's at 14% in the poll you mentioned. In other polls, I think is even lower. But there's something that the polls just don't measure, which is the enthusiasm. So it doesn't just come down to how many people you can get to vote for you. It comes down to how much enthusiasm.
You have to be careful, because enthusiasm isn't a replacement for a vote in the ballot.
That's right.
Because some campaigns were super. Look at the 2020 election in the US. The Biden campaign was super low energy. He hardly did any rallies. He was like, I remember one of our friends working in the press in the US counted how many official campaign hours Biden was doing per week, and it was like 35 hours a week. It's a French work week. Now I'm fine with French work week, but when you're trying to become president of the United States, I would expect it to be probably one of the most tiring moments in your life. And he was doing 35 hours. Trump was rallying like crazy. He had huge crowds, like nothing like anything Biden could do. It was just, the contrast was huge. And in the end, Biden won decisively, because I think campaign energy isn't. It's a positive indicator. You'd rather have that than no energy whatsoever. That's for sure. But it's not a complete proxy. And
I mean, Trump, of course, undermined his own campaign energy because he told his voters, "There's no point voting; it's rigged."
Yeah,
like the worst possible thing you could say to voters.
One of the craziest own goals in politics. I completely agree. But I don't know. So the energy is positive, and what Zemmour is saying is, if participation rates are going to be low, then a high energy campaign is going to be highly mobilized and probably could create an upset. Sure, why not? Sarkozy thought he would win back his party when he was running in 2016 to become the leader of the party and the presidential candidate for the 2017 election. His book was a huge bestseller. He got massive crowns. People were crying when they saw him. I mean, it was completely crazy. And he lost the primary. He didn't even make it to the presidential election. So I think you have to be careful with the energy argument. Yeah.
To do. No, I was just going to say. I mean, I think there's definitely a sense that this is. I think again of Trump. I think campaign energy is great. It just has to combine with several other factors to be a factor.
Yeah.
And I think if you have an overall atmospheric, events-based election, having individual charisma and energy doesn't necessarily carry it. You also have to have a narrative.
Yeah.
Trump had both when he won, and he had only one when he lost. And I think with this current French election, it's clear that the event in question, it was the pandemic that killed Trump off. And I think in this French election, the president's rivals are being killed off by Ukraine. It's looking like it's a khaki election. Term in British politics. It's like relate to the election at the turn of the century, where the Conservative Party handily defeated the Liberals because they were divided and there was a war on. But the thing about khaki elections is they create very unstable governments because you ride this wave of unnatural support that has nothing to do with your domestic politics. You win, but then your mandate evaporates, and you're actually worse off because you don't have the heart. You don't have to go through what you would have had to do if you're fighting a hard fought campaign. On the issues, you don't have the support for the issues you need, and the real risk is, I think this could see, an incumbent hang on, but the risk is that he has a uniquely weak president in charge of France for the next 8 years.
Yeah, and I think it's a good transition to the kind of post-election, if we have to kind of look at that, because it looks very likely Macron will be re-elected. You never know, but it looks very likely he's going to get re-elected. And I think you're pointing at something that is quite true, quite accurate actually right now, in the worries, especially in the Macron camp, because his campaign is very low energy. He only started campaigning like a week ago, which is kind of crazy when you think about it. Of course, he had COVID, he had Ukraine, so it was tough for him. But he could have, in January, decided to start the campaign in January. But he decided not to for different tactical reasons, I guess. But I agree with you, because I think Macron was elected in 2017 for different reasons. He got a bit lucky. Let's face it. He got a bit lucky that the socialists decided to run one of the kind of more fringe candidates they had, rather than more of a centrist. He got a bit lucky then François Fillon had all those scandals on his back, and he wasn't, facing maybe a Sarkozy who would have been, I think, more pugnacious and harder to wear down with those kind of scandals, or Alain Juppé, who was more of a centrist. So he got kind of a good alignment of stars to win in 2017, and especially in a campaign where we didn't really talk much about the issues, we talked about Fillon scandals, we talked about all of those things, but we didn't talk much about the issues back in 2017, especially on the kind of security, identity questions, which was a bit surprising, to be honest, because France, a few months before that, was being rocked by a series of terrorist attacks. And in the end, we barely actually talked about it in the election. It's been kind of a strange election. And so all those issues came back during Macron's presidency, but he had kind of... So first of all, he didn't have much of a strong backbone on those issues, which was a bit of an issue, a bit of concern. And secondly, he had no strong mandate. So he had so many clashes within his own majority where people didn't feel they were elected to kind of toughen up on those issues. And then also on kind of more kind of economic and social questions, there's a feeling there wasn't much of a good debate either. And it's hard to think that the Gilets jaunes weren't partly a product of that. It's obviously a product of many things, but a product of a campaign where a lot of the issues didn't feel like they were talked about. The cathartic moment of the presidential election didn't happen in 2017. And if it doesn't happen in 2022, you could feel like something along those lines could happen in the next 5 years, where people feel like they didn't get this moment of democratic respiration, breathing, where they could kind of air out ideas and get angry about them, talk about them, but at least kind of handle those issues. Yeah. Sebastian?
Oh, yes, sir.
You don't have to. I thought you wanted to say something about that.
No. I mean, I think that's undoubtedly the case. That actually, this is part of the problem with having these quite spaced out elections in the French system. They provide a strong president if you have a strong president, but if you have a weak president, that's a long period of strategic drift, a long period of political drift.
It used to be 7 years.
Yeah, sorry, I got mixed up on that earlier. There's such is the keenness of British interest in French politics.
It's 5 years now. It used to be 7 years. It's been 5 years since the 2002 election. There's another thing which is interesting, which is the legislative election is riding on the back of the French presidential election. And so usually what happens is whoever wins the presidential election, since the French at heart are essentially royalists, they will give a majority to whoever's elected. So, back in 2017, I remember joking, saying, there's no way Macron's going to get a majority if he wins. The guy's a nobody. He's going to get nobodies in Parliament. That's not going to work. And it worked. It completely worked. You could have put a goat with a Macron sign on top of his head and he would have been elected. He got one of the largest majorities in the history of the Fifth Republic. It really tells you, some of them end up being very good MPs since. but it really shows how kind of monarchist the French are in their kind of relationship to the institutions. We elected a king. We need to make sure he at least has a majority to do what he wanted to do in the first place.
Yeah. And the interesting thing is that the legislative landscape, the spectrum of parties in parliament, is going to be further splintered with the entry of Zemmour's party. I mean, whatever happens in the first and second rounds of the presidential election, the chances are that Zemmour is going to go on and run in the legislative elections, which means that he will have to set up a parliamentary group, and he will have to recruit people to run for office in every single one of these départements, right, of these constituencies. And what you saw in 2017 with Macron was that part of the campaign, part of the drive to recruit candidates for Macron's campaign in 2017 was kind of amateur. It would be, I think, a charitable way to put it. I mean, he ended up drafting people who had no experience whatsoever of politics, which is not an issue in itself, but they also had no knowledge of politics whatsoever. He ended up drafting a lot of people who weren't necessarily cogent in their in the way that they expressed their views. So that made for a lot of great meme content. And we'll see what happens with Zemmour. I mean, I think he's obviously going to draft a lot of people who were previously involved with either Le Rassemblement National, Marine Le Pen's party, or Les Républicains, the center-right party. But maybe there's going to be a substantial share of political neophytes.
And I want to add something about this, because the electoral race for the legislative election is going to be quite tough. It's going to be quite splintered. But we haven't talked about Le Pen at all. Le Pen, as it stands, is by far the likeliest to make it to the runoff against Macron. And I think that's quite a major feat. She has managed to keep together her electoral base, which has become much more working class than in the past. I was actually quite struck. I was listening to a TV show with Valérie Pécresse, and they got different kind of random people from all across France to ask Pécresse some questions. And they had, or they didn't have to, but they were encouraged to say who had they voted for back in 2017. And so one of them was a Le Pen voter. And her question, she's a Le Pen voter, and she asked Pécresse about discriminations in the workplace. And I was like, wow, this is an electorate that has really changed. She was a kind of young woman. I think she had some kids. I think the father left or something like that. And I was thinking, in a kind of alternative reality, if she wasn't called Le Pen, if she wasn't the leader of Rassemblement National, I think her platform would, to some extent, you have to imagine a little bit, but kind of work on a kind of a left-wing spectrum, actually. She seems very comfortable denouncing Zemmour as being racist, as being too far to the right. She seems a lot more comfortable nowadays in the kind of slightly patriotic left-wing nationalist in some ways. And it's quite striking to see, actually, that she has completely shifted her identity. And I think that's who she is profoundly, because she got rid, or she lost all the kind of more right-wing, anti-immigration, Christian identity people to Zemmour over the past few weeks. And now she has, in contrast, she seems to have moderated compared to Zemmour. And she seems a lot more comfortable with what she's doing. But the issue she'll have is she only has yes men right now in the party, which is a bit of an issue. And the fact she lost so many of his people, despite her being ahead of Zemmour in polls, she's losing people to Zemmour despite her having a better chance at making the runoff, really tells me that the atmosphere within the party must be quite toxic. That it's a mainly issue of human resources and kind of her trying to control the party to firmly, not leaving any kind of internal breathing. Because it's not normal you start bleeding so many people to Zemmour, despite the fact Zemmour is 8 to 6 points behind you.
Including apparently Marion.
Yeah, she lost Marion. She was actually supposed to speak at the NatCon conference.
No, so I saw.
But she didn't go to. Yeah, she lost her niece. Wow, I don't know.
And not to be underestimated, she also lost someone whom I think would be fair to say is the most eloquent of the. Although no, he was from the center right. Sorry, Guillaume Pelletier also spoke. He also spoke at the the Trocadero rally, and he was one of the more eloquent people of the center right.
Yeah.
He got tapped.
Well, Pelletier is an interesting case because he started his career as a Front National, Front National, and then he went to Philippe de Villiers' kind of right-wing nationalist party. Then he went to Les Républicains, and so now he's kind of moving back to Zemmour. He's had a kind of
that's very
interesting career.
You rarely have that sort of pendulum swing from the far right to the center and back to the far right,
and back to the far right. Yeah, so it's an interesting case. I don't know. It's gonna be tight. We'll probably do an episode a week before the election to kind of, I don't know, game it out, interview some people, do a profile on Macron. So we're gonna have to do a special episode on that, and probably going to do at least another one after the runoff, maybe. I don't know. We have to work it out, but we're definitely going to be covering a lot of the election of the past few weeks. So stay tuned for that. Wow, 53 minutes. It's a good episode. Thank you so much, Sebastian.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, it was wonderful bouncing ideas off a NatCon event. Please, if you're interested in a NatCon event, please do give a read to his 2 and probably 3 articles by the time.
Free if soon enough.
By the time we publish this tomorrow on Wednesday. It's a very interesting kind of nuanced take of the different tribes within the NatCon movement, what drives them, the tensions, what pushes them together. So I do recommend, and he's also a very interesting person to read on kind of Anglo politics in general, but kind of anything he writes on the Critic is definitely worth reading. Jorge, I want to thank you for coming back, but I think you're basically contractually obliged to be here every week. So thank you, I guess. And to our listeners, I say thank you so much, and see you all next week.